It's true, Melbourne property prices did fall last month. What does that mean though for property prices for the rest of the country? Well, that's exactly what I'll be covering today. In particular, I'm going to go through what's happening to our different major property markets around the country and some of the danger signs first-time property investors need to look out for, and what I expect to happen in 2024 based on my now 20 years of property investment experience. Hi, it's Nero here. I'm a buyer's agent who helps property investors, and 2023 has been a year that's surprised so many. When the year first started, the headlines were splashed with all sorts of messages about doom and gloom. And yet, what's happened? Well, property prices have risen, and in fact, the median property price in Australia right now is at an all-time high. Australian dwelling values have regained the losses from the recent downturn and surpassed their previous peak to reach a new record high, CoreLogic's National Daily HVI shows. After reaching a peak in April 2022, national home values fell 7.5%, finding a floor on the 29th of January 2023. Since bottoming out, the national HVI has risen by 8.1%, taking the market to a new record high on Wednesday, 22nd of November. So yes, that means that the median property price across Australia is higher today when the RBA's cash rate is at 4.35% than when it was at 0.1%. So you might be wondering, how can this possibly be the case? Well, CoreLogic's Executive Research Director, Tim Lawless, said this: "The V-shaped recovery may seem counterintuitive given high interest rates, deeply pessimistic levels of consumer sentiment, and high cost of living pressures. However, the recovery can be explained by an imbalance between supply and demand. From a supply perspective, advertised stock levels have held remarkably low through 2023. Although inventory levels are now rebalancing as vendor activity picks up, listings remain 16.6% below the previous 5-year average nationally. At the same time, demonstrated demand based on the volume of home sales is trending roughly in line with the 5-year average." And you can see in this next chart, which looks at the change in national home values from April 2022, you can see that April 2022 was the peak. Property prices then dropped until January. On average across the country, they dropped 7.5%, but since January have increased and are now sitting at 0.03% above where they were back in April of 2022. But that's at a national level. If we break it down into our major regions and look at the CoreLogic data again, we start to see a clearer picture of what's actually happening. So here we have a table looking at the change in dwelling values across our major regions as at 22nd of November 2023. Again, the data is from CoreLogic. And if we look at Sydney, we can see that property prices reached a peak in January 2022, and although this year in 2023 prices have risen 11.4% on average in Sydney, they're still 1.8% below their previous peak. Melbourne property prices are up 4.1% this year, but are still 3.6% below their previous peak, which was in March 2022. Brisbane property prices are up 11.3% this year at all-time highs. Adelaide property prices are up 7.7% this year, all-time highs. Perth property prices are up 12.3%, also at all-time highs. And across our regional markets, regional Victoria property prices have fallen, same with regional Tasmania and regional Northern Territory, but the other regional markets have all risen in value, with regional Queensland, regional South Australia and regional Western Australia all at record highs. So when you look at that table, you can clearly see that property prices are performing differently in different markets. But then what's all this hype about Melbourne property prices falling? Well, let's have a look at what happened across the country in our major markets last month. So here we have CoreLogic RP Data Daily Home Value Index, the monthly values as at the 30th of November 2023. And here you can see that Sydney property prices rose slightly, 0.3%. They were essentially flat. Melbourne last month dropped, but it only dropped by 0.1%. So for all the news you're seeing in the media, it's not as if Melbourne property prices are crashing. Now, that does not mean that I personally recommend Melbourne as a market to invest in. I think there are a lot of reasons why most investors should avoid the Melbourne market. I did an episode on this earlier on this year, and I'll link to that in the description below as well. Brisbane property prices, including the Gold Coast, rose 1.2% last month. Adelaide also 1.2%. Perth 1.9%. Then you look at Darwin here, property prices dropped 0.3%, and Hobart dropped 0.1%. Canberra, to the surprise of many, finally showed an uptick of 0.5% after property prices have fallen for most of this year. So then what are the danger signs for many investors? Well, many of them come from the fact that the media focuses very heavily on what happens in Sydney and Melbourne. And so despite the fact that multiple property markets are rising steeply across the country, you're going to see scary headlines like this. Australian home price growth slows as Sydney, Melbourne cool. Or horrifying news for Aussie house prices. Ominous signs have emerged in the auction markets of Sydney and Melbourne thanks to one decision by the Reserve Bank. And then this article goes to talk about how the latest rate rise is going to really strangle property price growth in Sydney and Melbourne. But again, if we go back and look at the data, this time from a visual perspective, you can see that from CoreLogic last month, only Melbourne property prices dropped 0.1%, Hobart dropped 0.1%, and Darwin dropped 0.3%. Property prices rose pretty much everywhere else. Okay, and yes, Sydney's price growth wasn't anything to talk about, but the fact is then you can see Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth rocketing along and many regional markets doing the same as well. So as a property investor, you don't want to be swayed by these scary headlines, which you are bound to see. I mean, remember what you saw at the end of 2022 and early 2023 about what was going to happen to the property market? You saw headlines like this: secret RBA modelling shows 20% drop in house prices, or Australia's fixed interest rates cliff to crush property prices in 2023. So you saw all these negative doom and gloom headlines at the start of 2023, and here we are as we get to the end of the year and property prices haven't just risen, they're at record highs in multiple markets around the country. So you've seen this happen before. I mean, maybe you were thinking about investing in property in 2023 and then got put off by those sorts of negative headlines or articles like this. More investors bail out as mortgage costs rise. This was back in July of 2023. And yet what's actually happened? Well, when you look at the data, you'll see that the number of investors in Australia has actually increased. Check out this chart from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or ABS. This chart shows new loan commitments across Australia. The bottom line there is investor loans. And what you can see is that in January, it reached a bottom, January 2023, and since then has been steadily increasing. So in fact, there's been an increase in the number of loans taken out by property investors. That's why you need to be focused on data and not be misled by the scary headlines. So the danger signs for most investors is either you're going to see these typical types of headlines come round again at the start of 2024 and be put off again and say, oh, well, maybe we should now wait and see. And I expect that if you wait and see, you're going to wait and miss out as many markets around the country are set to rise. But the second danger sign is simply this: you can't just invest blindly. Different markets will perform differently. I do expect, for example, Melbourne to struggle in terms of capital growth going forwards. But there's no doubt that the data shows that there are multiple markets around Australia, outside of Melbourne, maybe even outside of Sydney, that are set to rise quite dramatically in 2024. And if you want help to try and work out, well, where are these areas? Check the link in the description to get totally for free the digital version and audio version of my book. It's a full property investing blueprint based on my now over 20 years of property investment experience. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.